I stood in my doctoral robes when my phone buzzed. My mother's voicemail was under 1 minute long. Yet it killed a love I had trusted for 33 years. While I waited to cross the stage, my family was toasting at my brother's barbecue. That night, I finally stopped trying to earn their pride. Months later, seeing his name surface in an active fraud investigation file on my work monitor, I knew the true shock was still coming. My name is Winter Whitmore. At 33 years old, I stood in the cavernous, dimly lit staging area behind the main auditorium of my university in St. Louis, draped in the heavy velvet of a doctoral gown. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and the nervous perspiration of 100 scholars waiting to be minted. I was about to receive my doctorate in forensic accounting and public compliance, a field dedicated to uncovering hidden truths, tracing obscured lines of credit, and finding exactly where the numbers stopped making sense. It was a fitting discipline for me, though I had not yet realized that the most fraudulent ledger in my life belonged to my own family. The staging area was a sea of black robes and brightly colored hoods. Families milled about in the designated visitor sections beyond the double doors, their muffled laughter and chatter echoing through the concrete hallways. I stood alone near a folding table stacked with commencement programs. My phone rested in my palm, a cold rectangle of glass and metal that I had been checking every 2 minutes. I had done everything right. I always did. Weeks ago, I mailed out the heavy cardstock invitations, complete with a detailed schedule, a map of the campus, and a highlighted seating chart showing exactly where they would have the best view of the stage. I had booked their hotel rooms. I had made dinner reservations for 6 o'clock that evening to celebrate. Just that morning, at 7 o'clock, I had sent a cheerful reminder in the family group chat, confirming the doors opened at 9 o'clock and the procession began at 10 o'clock sharp. At 45 minutes past 9, exactly 15 minutes before the Grand Marshal was scheduled to lead us into the hall, my phone vibrated. It was not a text saying they were stuck in traffic or struggling to find parking. It was a voicemail notification from my mother. I stepped away from the crowd, pressing the phone to my ear to hear over the mounting din of the staging area. My mother's voice flowed through the speaker, light, breezy, and entirely devoid of urgency or guilt. "Hi, Winnie," her voice chimed, using the childhood nickname I had long outgrown. "Listen, honey, we are not going to be able to make it to the auditorium this morning. Beckett just got the final call. He signed the expansion contract for Ash and Honey Smokehouse. Can you believe it? The investors greenlit the second location. We decided to throw a spontaneous barbecue at his place to celebrate, while the weather is so gorgeous. We will watch the recording of your walk later. Okay, so proud of you. Love you. Bye." The message ended. The silence in my ear was absolute, contrasting sharply with the booming voice of a faculty coordinator shouting instructions over a megaphone nearby. I did not immediately react. I am a forensic accountant. My instinct is to gather data before forming a conclusion. I opened the messaging app. In the family group chat, right below my unacknowledged morning reminder, was a photo uploaded by my father. The image was crisp and vibrant. It showed my family gathered around my brother Beckett's large oak outdoor table. The table was draped in a red checkered tablecloth. Platter after platter of glazed ribs, smoked brisket, and grilled corn sat in the center. My mother was holding up a plastic cup of beer, her head thrown back in mid-laugh. My father had his arms slung proudly around Beckett's shoulders. Beckett, handsome and glowing with the casual charisma of someone who naturally commanded the center of every room, was holding up a pair of silver grilling tongs like a trophy. Below the image, a caption from my father read, "Big things happening for the Whitmore boys today," followed by 3 fire emojis. There was no mention of St. Louis. There was no mention of a doctorate. There was no mention of me. I stared at the screen until the backlight dimmed and went black. I slipped the phone into the hidden pocket of my gown. I did not cry. Crying requires a sudden shock, a subversion of expectations. What I felt was not a sudden wound, but the dull, heavy ache of a chronic condition finally being diagnosed. My mother's words echoed in my mind. "We will watch the recording later." She had equated the culmination of a half-decade of grueling academic labor, of sleepless nights analyzing public compliance models and defending my dissertation against rigorous academic panels, to a child's birthday clip or a funny video forwarded on social media. It was a secondary event, content to be consumed at their leisure, if at all. I took my place in the alphabetical line for the procession. I smoothed the velvet trim of my hood. My face was a mask of placid indifference, the kind of professional composure I used when auditing hostile corporate clients. But beneath the heavy academic regalia, an internal architecture was collapsing. I was experiencing a quiet, total awakening. I saw the pattern of my 33 years with agonizing clarity. I was the reliable undercurrent, the safety net, the background noise. I was the person whose milestones were optional, whose presence was assumed but never celebrated. I was always the one rescheduled, pushed back, or moved to the margins in the grand narrative of the Whitmore family. Nervous. The voice came from my right. I turned to see an older female graduate student standing next to me in line. She looked to be in her late 50s, with striking silver hair pinned up neatly and kind, crinkling eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She adjusted her own mortarboard and gave me a warm, knowing smile. "A little," I lied smoothly. "Just ready to get it over with." She tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over my solitary stance, noting the way my eyes had not darted toward the visitor doors even once. "Do you have folks out there in the crowd today?" she asked gently. "No," I said, the word tasting like dry ash in my mouth. "They had a last-minute business emergency. It is just me today." The woman's expression softened. It was a look of pure, unadulterated empathy, lacking any of the pity that would have broken my resolve. "Well, that is their profound loss," she said firmly. "I am Margaret, by the way. Getting my degree in educational psychology, it took me 20 years to get back here, and my kids could not fly out from the coast." "I am Winter," I replied, offering a tight, appreciative nod. Margaret reached out and gave my arm a brief, reassuring squeeze. "Tell you what, Winter, when they call your name, I am going to clap so loud my palms bruise, and you do the same for me." "Deal." "Deal," I said. The grand wooden doors swung open. The majestic swelling chords of the graduation march filled the air. The line began to move forward, a slow, synchronized trudge toward the brightly lit stage. We filed into the massive hall, taking our seats under the blinding theatrical lights. The ceremony proceeded with the usual agonizing slowness. Speeches about the future, about perseverance, about changing the world. I heard none of it. I was busy cataloging the empty spaces in my life, organizing the ledger of my family's emotional deficits. Finally, it was time for the hoods to be placed and the diplomas to be handed out. Row by row, we stood. When it was my turn, I walked up the wooden stairs. The lights were so bright they blurred the thousands of faces in the audience into a singular dark ocean. I handed my phonetic name card to the dean at the podium. "Winter Whitmore," his voice boomed over the state-of-the-art sound system. "Doctor of Philosophy in Accounting." I stepped forward to receive the heavy leather folder. As I reached out my hand, a sharp, piercing cheer erupted from the front row of the graduate seating. "Yes, go Winter." It was Margaret. She was standing up, clapping her hands together with a ferocious, joyful intensity, her silver hair catching the stage lights. I smiled at her, a genuine, fragile thing, and nodded my head. I walked off the stage holding my degree. The leather was smooth and substantial. The gold lettering caught the light. Yet, as I descended the stairs to the sound of a total stranger's applause, the absence of my family crystallized into something hard and permanent. Receiving my doctorate to the cheers of a woman I had met 20 minutes prior made the abandonment infinitely more painful. It stripped away all my excuses. There was no traffic jam, no miscommunication, no valid justification. There was only the stark, undeniable reality that they had chosen a plate of barbecue over my life's work. The pain was incredibly sharp, but it was also clean. It was the kind of pain that cauterizes a wound. As I walked back to my seat, the final remnants of the hopeful, eager-to-please daughter burned away, leaving behind someone entirely new. Someone who understood the numbers, who knew how to audit a lie, and who was finally ready to close the family account. Beckett was the kind of person who possessed his own gravitational pull. You did not just walk into a room where my brother was, you were pulled into his orbit. He was effortlessly handsome, with a disarming smile and a knack for storytelling that could make a parking ticket sound like a grand, hilarious adventure. He was the undisputed master of the grill, a maestro of smoked meats and secret rubs, but his true talent was alchemy. He could take his own failures, his missed deadlines, his forgotten obligations, and spin them into charming, self-deprecating anecdotes that left everyone laughing and reaching for their wallets to buy him the next round. Growing up, my parents never sat me down and announced they preferred their son. They were too polite, too deeply ingrained in Midwestern domesticity for that kind of overt cruelty. The favoritism was not a declaration, it was a calibration. Every metric of success, every standard of acceptable behavior in our household, was quietly, imperceptibly adjusted to accommodate Beckett. I remember the autumn he dropped out of community college. He had lasted exactly 3 semesters. He came home on a Tuesday afternoon, dumped his backpack by the front door, and announced he was done with textbooks. He was going to focus on his culinary passion. He said he was going to revolutionize backyard dining. My father, who had spent the previous 18 years preaching the gospel of a traditional education, did not miss a beat. He clapped Beckett on the shoulder and poured them both a glass of bourbon. "That is the entrepreneurial spirit," my father declared, raising his glass. "School is not for everyone, son. You have to follow your gut." My mother spent the next 4 weeks telling every neighbor and church acquaintance about Beckett's bold new venture, framing his academic surrender as a stroke of visionary genius. The contrast was a quiet, grinding agony. 2 years later, when I was fighting a brutal academic schedule to maintain the fellowship that paid my tuition, I spent 72 hours straight in the campus library. I was running on vending machine coffee in sheer panic, terrified of losing the funding that kept my head above water. When I finally dragged myself back to our house for a brief Sunday dinner, I was pale, shaking, and exhausted. My mother took one look at me across the dinner table. She did not ask about my thesis. She did not ask if I needed help. "Why are you always so high-strung?" "Winter," she asked, her tone laced with mild irritation rather than concern. "You really do not know how to enjoy life. You should take a page out of your brother's book. He is so relaxed. He knows how to live." I swallowed the bite of dry chicken in my mouth. I swallowed the response burning in my throat. I nodded and went back to my room to study. That became the blueprint for our family dynamics. Beckett's achievements, no matter how minor or contrived, were monumental events. They demanded real people, real dinners, real laughter. When he perfected a new barbecue sauce recipe, my parents hosted a tasting party for 30 guests. When he got a small business loan, they threw a block party that lasted until 2 in the morning. My achievements, on the other hand, were administrative footnotes. They were acknowledged, but never truly celebrated. When I passed the certified public accountant exam on my first try, a statistical rarity that I had sacrificed 6 months of my life to achieve, my mother sent me a text message with a thumbs-up emoji and a promise to call me over the weekend. The call never came. When I was published in a major financial journal, my father said, "Good job, kiddo." Without taking his eyes off the Sunday football game, I adapted. Human beings are incredibly resilient when it comes to emotional starvation. You learn to forage. You learn to feed yourself. Over the years, I became intimately acquainted with the solitary nature of my own success. I drove myself to academic conferences across state lines, spending 8 hours alone in a cheap sedan, gripping the steering wheel and practicing my presentations to the empty passenger seat. I learned the precise angle to hold my phone to take a selfie, holding a certificate of merit in a deserted hotel corridor. I grew accustomed to the hollow ritual of returning to a dark, quiet apartment after a major milestone, taking off my sensible heels, and sweeping the floor or washing my single coffee mug to anchor myself back to reality. For over a decade, I survived by spinning my own narrative. I convinced myself that my family was not bad, just different. I told myself they simply had a different language for love. Beckett needed the loud, external validation because he was an artist, a creative soul. I was the rock. I was the capable, independent daughter who did not need hand-holding. I rationalized their absence as a compliment to my strength. They did not worry about me because they knew I would always be fine. But a lie repeated for 33 years eventually erodes the soul holding it. The rationalizations require more and more energy to maintain, until the foundation simply crumbles under the weight of the evidence. That night, after the graduation ceremony, I did not go to a fancy restaurant. I did not meet up with colleagues. I drove my 10-year-old car back to my small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. I parked in my assigned spot, walked up the 3 flights of stairs, and unlocked my door. The apartment was exactly as I had left it at 6 in the morning. The air was stale. The silence was absolute. I walked into the bedroom and carefully took off the doctoral gown. The velvet heavy and suffocating, I draped it over the back of a wooden dining chair. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the framed degree resting on my nightstand. The gold seal gleamed in the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. In the quiet of that room, the protective walls I had built around my heart finally shattered. The pieces fell away, leaving me exposed to the freezing, indisputable truth. The issue was never just a missed graduation ceremony. The barbecue was merely the final, undeniable piece of evidence in a lifelong audit. I looked back at the ledger of my life. I saw all the unreturned phone calls, the forgotten birthdays, the dismissed accomplishments. I saw the thousands of hours I had spent trying to mold myself into a daughter worthy of their undivided attention. I had been striving for a promotion in a company that did not even know I worked there. I had spent my entire youth existing as a contingency plan. I was the reliable backdrop against which Beckett's vibrant life could be showcased. I was the insurance policy they never wanted to cash in, the sturdy shelf built solely to hold the trophies of someone else's pride. My mother's voicemail had not been a mistake or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was the purest distillation of their priorities. I did not shed a single tear as I sat there in the dark. The time for crying had passed years ago. Somewhere between a lonely drive to Chicago and a missed phone call on a Sunday afternoon, instead, a profound, icy calm washed over me. The pain of the realization was immense, a physical ache in my chest, but it was accompanied by an exhilarating sense of liberation. The invisible tether that had bound me to their approval snapped clean in two. I realized I could never win a game where the rules were written to ensure my defeat. The only logical mathematical solution was to walk off the board entirely. I stood up from the bed, leaving the degree on the nightstand. The girl who had waited her whole life for her family to notice her was gone. I did not pick up my phone to draft a multi-paragraph manifesto. I did not record a tearful video or send a barrage of angry questions into our shared chat. Dramatic exits are for people who still harbor a secret, desperate hope that someone will chase after them. I harbored nothing. The quiet in my living room was no longer a symptom of my isolation. It was the foundation of my new autonomy. With the heavy velvet of my academic regalia abandoned on the furniture behind me, I walked straight to my small laminate desk and opened my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a stark bluish glow across the dim room. I bypassed my personal messages entirely and navigated directly to my professional inbox. Sitting at the very top, marked with a red urgency flag from 3 days ago, was an email from a managing partner at North Ledger Advisory. North Ledger was a formidable boutique financial investigation consulting firm based out of Philadelphia. They did not handle standard tax returns or friendly corporate audits. They were the apex predators of urban finance. They specialized in tracking down public subsidy fraud, dissecting convoluted corporate loan files, and dismantling complex models designed to conceal massive financial obligations. It was grueling, unglamorous, and incredibly vital work. They dug through the digital dirt of shell companies, municipal grants, and offshore holding accounts to find exactly where the money bled out. The email was a formal offer for the position of senior compliance analyst. The salary was generous, the benefits were comprehensive, and the work was exactly what I had trained for over the last several years. For 72 hours, that offer had been sitting in my inbox, untouched. I had been agonizing over the decision. Accepting it meant packing up my life and moving halfway across the country, leaving Missouri behind. Subconsciously, leaving my home state felt like surrendering my geographic proximity to my family, which I equated with surrendering my last, fragile opportunity to be properly seen by them. I had convinced myself that if I just stayed close, if I just achieved one more milestone right in their backyard, they would eventually turn their heads and recognize my worth. My mother's breezy voicemail that afternoon had obliterated that hesitation. Staying in St. Louis was no longer an act of patience. It was an exercise in masochism. Remaining in their orbit was simply prolonging an illusion that had already cost me over 3 decades of my life. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a fraction of a second. I hit reply. I typed out a concise, professional message, thanking the managing partner for the opportunity and formally accepting the position. I confirmed my availability to relocate and start in exactly 6 weeks. I did not read the draft a second time. I moved the cursor to the send button and clicked it. The email vanished from my outbox. A soft sound echoed from the laptop speakers. It was the digital sound of a very heavy door closing so gently that the latch barely clicked, yet locking permanently from the inside. I did not stop there. The momentum of that single of a definitive choice propelled me forward into a state of hyper-focused administrative execution. If I was going to leave, I was going to leave entirely. I refused to remain the tethered, dependable child who could be summoned or dismissed at their convenience. I was going to become the sole proprietor of my own existence. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to my local credit union. Within 15 minutes, I had initiated the transfer of my entire savings and checking balances to a new national bank with a strong presence on the East Coast. I changed the mailing address on my accounts to a private post office box I would rent online in Philadelphia the next morning. Next, I went to the websites of the 3 major credit bureaus. One by one, I placed a hard security freeze on my credit files. It was a standard precaution I often recommended to my corporate clients to prevent identity theft, but doing it for myself felt profoundly symbolic. I was locking the vault. I was securing my name, my history, and my future against any unauthorized access. I treated my own life like a forensic audit, closing every vulnerability, sealing every potential leak. I spent the next 2 hours moving methodically through my apartment. I pulled a sturdy, fireproof lockbox from the back of my closet. Inside, I gathered my birth certificate, my passport, my social security card, and the physical copy of my newly minted doctorate. I organized my tax returns from the past 7 years, sliding them into crisp manila folders. Every piece of paper that proved I existed, every document that tethered me to the legal framework of society, was securely filed away under my own lock and key. For the first time, I felt like the primary shareholder of my own identity. It was past midnight when my phone finally buzzed against the laminate wood of the desk, the screen illuminated, displaying a text message from my mother. The barbecue must have wound down. The guests had likely gone home. The grill was cooling, and she had finally remembered the daughter she had dismissed that morning. The message read, "Hey Winnie. So sorry. Again, we missed the walk. Beckett is just over the moon about the new restaurant. Do not hold a grudge just because of missing one event. We will take you out to dinner next month to make up for it. Love you." I stared at the glowing text. One event. That was how she categorized a doctoral graduation. It was just an event, easily swapped out for a platter of smoked ribs and a round of beers. A few months ago, I would have painstakingly crafted a response that balanced my hurt with a desperate desire to keep the peace. I would have typed and deleted a dozen variations, trying to find the exact combination of words that would make her realize she had wounded me without actually starting an argument. I would have accepted the vague promise of a makeup dinner, knowing full well it would likely be canceled or double booked when my brother needed something else. That version of Winter Whitmore no longer existed. I picked up the phone. My thumb moved with steady, detached precision across the digital keyboard. I did not demand an apology. I did not list my grievances. I did not ask why Beckett's restaurant expansion was more important than my entire academic career. I simply established the new reality of our relationship in a single, polite sentence. I am moving to Philadelphia for a new job in 6 weeks, and I need some space to rethink my relationship with this family. I hit send. I did not wait for the inevitable flurry of confused or defensive replies. I did not block her number. Doing so would indicate an emotional reaction, a temper tantrum. I simply turned on the silent function, muting the device completely. I set the phone face down on the desk. The room was perfectly quiet once more. I walked over to the window and looked out at the empty, dark street below. The air in the apartment felt different now. It was no longer stagnant. It felt crisp, clear, and entirely my own. I had taken the first steps out of the shadows, and for the first time in my 33 years, I was charting a course where I was the only priority. Philadelphia suited me in a way my hometown never could. It was an unapologetic, concrete grid of a city, loud and intensely practical. People here walked fast and spoke faster, leaving no room for the polite, passive-aggressive pleasantries I had grown up navigating. The city did not require me to shrink my ambitions to make others comfortable. I thrived in the anonymity of the crowded morning subways and the stark, towering architecture of the financial district. At North Ledger Advisory, my particular brand of hypervigilance was not a personality flaw. It was a highly billable asset. Within my first 2 months, I had developed a reputation for catching the microscopic anomalies that seasoned auditors often skimmed past. I found a hidden offshore holding company in a municipal waste management contract just by cross-referencing a recurring typographical error in their quarterly expense reports. My days were structured, predictable, and deeply satisfying. I was finally building a solid foundation made entirely of verifiable facts. Exactly 3 months after I unpacked my last moving box, the stability I had cultivated fractured. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a few minutes past 4 o'clock. I was at my desk, deep into a complex spreadsheet regarding a housing development subsidy, when a notification popped up on my personal phone. It was an automated email from one of the major credit bureaus where I had placed my security freezes before leaving Missouri. The subject line indicated a blocked inquiry, which was standard, but the body of the message contained a routine summary alert that made my blood run cold. It flagged a newly reported commercial loan modification. According to the bureau, a substantial line of credit had recently undergone a structural revision, and my name was listed in the guarantor history. I sat perfectly still, the hum of the office ventilation system suddenly sounding very loud in my ears. I had never guaranteed a commercial loan in my life. I had never co-signed a mortgage, a car note, or even a basic credit card for another human being. My financial footprint was meticulously isolated. I closed the housing subsidy file on my dual monitors. I pulled up a secure, encrypted browser and logged directly into the credit monitoring portal. I needed the raw data. It took me 45 minutes of navigating through complex credit reporting layers to isolate the specific trade line. The modification was attached to a commercial business loan originally issued 18 months prior, but the recent addendum had triggered the alert. The total value of the modified credit line was staggering $750,000. My eyes scanned down to the registered legal entity attached to the debt. It was listed as Embercrest Hospitality Group, Limited Liability Company. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. I knew that name. I had seen it printed on the bottom of a glossy menu prototype months ago. Embercrest Hospitality Group was the corporate umbrella that owned Ash and Honey Smokehouse. It was my brother's restaurant chain. My hands began to tremble, just slightly, as my mind raced to connect the data points. I utilized a few public record databases I had access to through my firm, pulling the filed Uniform Commercial Code documents associated with Embercrest. when the scanned PDF finally loaded on my screen. I scrolled past the boilerplate legal jargon, searching for the guarantor addendum. On page 14, I found it. There, at the bottom of a dense paragraph detailing joint and several liability, was my full legal name. Next to it was an electronic signature. It was a remarkably good imitation of my cursive, capturing the sharp slant of the first letter perfectly, but it was not mine. I always crossed my consonants with a distinct upward flick, a habit formed in high school. This letter was crossed with a flat, horizontal line, but the forged signature was not the detail that knocked the breath out of my lungs. It was the timestamp printed directly beneath the electronic ink. The document had been executed on the 24th of May, at exactly 10 minutes past 11 o'clock in the morning. I leaned back in my ergonomic mesh chair, staring at the screen until the numbers blurred. The 24th of May, 10 minutes past 11 in the morning. That was the exact date and time I had been standing on a brightly lit stage, receiving a heavy leather folder, listening to a stranger cheer for me because my family had claimed to be busy with a spontaneous barbecue. The sudden, violent collision of my personal history and this financial record changed the entire landscape of my past. I did not scream. I did not pick up the phone to call my mother and demand answers. The anger I felt was too absolute, too clinical for a screaming match. My forensic training took over completely. I was no longer a betrayed sister. I was an investigator looking at a hostile entity. I immediately drafted a formal, legally binding request to the issuing commercial bank, demanding a complete certified copy of the entire loan file, including all origination documents, addendums, and digital access logs, citing a suspected case of severe identity fraud. Next, I used my firm's internal directory to find a recommendation for a private attorney. By 6 o'clock that evening, I had retained a ruthless civil litigator in downtown Philadelphia who specialized exclusively in complex identity theft and corporate financial abuse. I walked out of my office building into the cool evening air of the city. The streetlights were flickering on, illuminating the busy sidewalks. My family had not simply chosen my brother over me that day. The profound, sickening shock was the realization that my absence at that graduation was not a byproduct of their neglect. It was a requirement for their fraud. While I was dressed in an academic gown, mourning their lack of love, they were sitting in a room somewhere, using the very milestone that kept me occupied as a smokescreen to forge my name and pledge my financial future to my brother's empire. The rhythm of my work at North Ledger Advisory was usually a steady, predictable hum of data ingestion and risk assessment. I found comfort in the absolute binary nature of mathematics. Numbers did not possess ulterior motives. They either reconciled or they did not. However, almost concurrently with the shocking discovery of my compromised credit profile, my professional sanctuary was breached by a chilling coincidence. Our firm secured a massive oversight contract from a federal regulatory agency. We were tasked with conducting a retroactive, granular audit of a comprehensive urban revitalization grant program. The initiative had been launched a year prior to stimulate economic recovery for small businesses operating within a newly designated, historically distressed commercial district in Kansas City, Missouri. Millions of dollars of public taxpayer funds had been aggressively deployed to subsidize infrastructure renovations, stimulate local hiring, and revitalize the dilapidated urban corridor. My specific assignment was technically demanding but well within my expertise. I was instructed to construct a multi-tiered reconciliation model. I needed to build a relational database that would automatically cross-reference the original commercial grant applications against the business's reported gross revenues, their certified state tax payroll filings, and the final reimbursement disbursement ledgers maintained by the City Council. Essentially, I was building a digital sieve designed to catch anyone who had lied on their paperwork to secure free government money. For the first 2 weeks, I was buried in municipal codes and data formatting. On the third Tuesday of the month, I finally ran the primary algorithm against the first massive batch of regional data. The software churned for several hours before generating a variance report. It flagged a list of 42 distinct corporate entities that exhibited severe mathematical anomalies requiring immediate manual forensic review. I opened the exported spreadsheet on my right monitor. I began scrolling down the list, mentally preparing to dive into the tedious work of checking routing numbers and tax identification codes. I reached row 18. The text in the primary cell was stark black against the bright white background. Embercrest Hospitality Group, right beside it, listed under the operational trade name column, was Ash and Honey Smokehouse. My hand froze on the computer mouse. The air in my office felt as though it had been instantly vacuumed out. The glowing screen seemed to pulse, the letters burning into my vision. It was a statistical impossibility, a cruel joke of geographic and professional overlap. Yet there it was. My brother's expanding barbecue empire was sitting squarely in the middle of a high-priority federal fraud investigation. My corporate ethics training overrode my initial shock. I stood up immediately, leaving the spreadsheet open, and walked straight down the carpeted hallway to the corner office of my managing director, a sharp, pragmatic man named David. I knocked twice and stepped inside. "David, we have a critical compliance issue on the Kansas City revitalization portfolio. I need to formally declare a severe familial conflict of interest." David looked up from his tablet, his brow furrowing. "Explain." Row 18 on the preliminary variance report is a corporate entity owned and operated by my immediate family, I stated, my voice remarkably level despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "My brother is the primary shareholder of Embercrest Hospitality Group. I cannot objectively audit this file. I need to hand the entire regional portfolio over to another analyst immediately." David leaned back in his chair, tapping his stylus against the glass desk. He knew my analytical speed was unmatched on this specific software. Reassigning the entire city block of data would push the project timeline back by 3 weeks. "I appreciate the immediate disclosure, Winter," David said thoughtfully. "But pulling you off the data architecture entirely jeopardizes our delivery deadline. Let us establish a strict firewall protocol instead. You remain the lead data engineer. You run the numbers, you isolate the discrepancies, and you build the evidence logs. However, you are officially recused from drafting any executive summaries, making any compliance judgments, or participating in the final penalty recommendations for that specific entity. Your job is just to hand us the raw, unvarnished math. Can you do that objectively?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "I will follow the numbers exactly where they lead." I returned to my desk, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I isolated the Embercrest Hospitality Group file. Segregating their data into a secure, monitored subfolder, I began to pull apart my brother's financial architecture, layer by layer. The deeper I dug into the documentation, the more my professional detachment dissolved into a profound, chilling horror. Beckett had not simply padded a few miscellaneous expenses or exaggerated a minor marketing budget. He had engineered a blatant, multi-layered mechanism of public subsidy theft. I started with the capital expenditure ledgers. Embercrest had undertaken a massive renovation of their flagship kitchen to support the new expansion. The submitted invoices detailed a state-of-the-art commercial smoke exhaust ventilation system, 3 industrial-grade rotary smokers, and a comprehensive, mandatory safety training program for the kitchen staff. The upgrades were incredibly expensive. The glaring issue was the funding sequence. When I ran the exact invoice numbers and vendor dates through the broader state and federal databases, red flags exploded across my software. Beckett had submitted the exact same stack of receipts to the Municipal Urban Revitalization Fund, a separate state-level agricultural small business grant, and a federal culinary development subsidy. He had successfully requested and received full reimbursement from 3 entirely different government sources for the exact same physical equipment and training program. It was a textbook case of overlapping disbursement fraud, commonly known as triple dipping. He had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit, unencumbered liquidity simply by photocopying his kitchen receipts and mailing them to different government agencies. The audacity of the scheme was staggering, but the human resources ledger was even worse. To qualify for the absolute highest tier of the Kansas City Municipal Grant, A business was legally required to prove they were actively employing a specific quota of full-time workers residing within the targeted, low-income zip codes. On his official grant application, signed under penalty of perjury, Beckett claimed to employ 28 full-time staff members from the required districts. I pulled the quarterly tax deduction records submitted to the Internal Revenue Service and laid them side by side with the grant application. The numbers immediately collapsed. The official tax withholdings reflected a permanent staff of perhaps 9 full-time employees. The remaining 19 individuals listed on the grant application were either entirely fabricated ghost employees or they were undocumented, temporary part-time workers being paid under the table, completely devoid of the benefits and wage protections the grant was specifically designed to subsidize. He was harvesting government funds meant to uplift a struggling community while simultaneously exploiting the very workforce he claimed to be supporting. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer scale of the liability my brother had created. But the final, most devastating layer of the audit was still waiting to be uncovered in the vendor payment logs. I began tracing the outgoing wire transfers, following the diverted, triple-dipped grant money as it flowed out of the Embercrest corporate accounts. A highly suspicious, disproportionate percentage of the funds was being funneled to a single, obscure supply company. According to the internal memos, this company was the exclusive premium provider of the specialty hickory smoking wood, custom spice dry rubs, and heavy kitchen hardware used by the restaurant. The company was registered as a limited liability corporation under a vague, generic alphanumeric name. They had no public-facing website, no standard commercial warehouse address, and their billing increments were perfectly, unnaturally round numbers. I utilized North Ledger's proprietary investigative software to pierce the corporate veil of the vendor. I initiated a deep-level search, bypassing the registered agent to identify the actual managing member holding the controlling interest of the shell company. The progress bar on my screen loaded, filling with green. The query completed. The underlying registration documents materialized. I stared at the name of the controlling member, Graham Whitmore, my father. The breath caught in my throat, choking me. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my hands flying up to cover my mouth. My father had deliberately incorporated a phantom shell company to act as a fictitious vendor. Beckett would authorize vastly inflated, fraudulent invoices for non-existent shipments of premium wood and kitchen supplies. He would pay those fake invoices using the fraudulently obtained government grant money, wiring the cash directly into my father's corporate account. From there, my father could easily wash the funds through his own legitimate business accounts and distribute the clean cash back into the family's personal ecosystem. The room spun. The isolated incidents of my life suddenly connected with terrifying clarity. This was no longer a tragic story about a family who merely undervalued their daughter. The casual neglect, the persistent favoritism, the endless excuses, they were all just superficial symptoms of a much darker reality. I was not just looking at a careless brother and an enabling father. I was staring at a highly coordinated, multi-generational network of systemic financial fraud. And as I sat there, remembering the massive commercial loan modification bearing my forged signature, the ultimate, horrifying truth settled into my bones. They had not just ignored me. They had identified my pristine credit, my clean legal name, and my desperate, blind loyalty. And they had carefully integrated me into their criminal architecture as a perfectly insulated, highly profitable, and completely disposable operational cog. I did not call the police immediately. I did not forward my findings to the federal prosecutor's office, even though my professional duty technically demanded it. Despite the staggering weight of their betrayal, a tiny residual phantom of familial obligation compelled me to offer them one final, narrow off-ramp. It was not an act of love. It was a calculated transfer of liability. I needed them to know that their destruction, when it arrived, would be entirely of their own making. I sat at my dining table in Philadelphia, a glass of ice water sweating onto a coaster. I dialed my mother's cell phone. It rang 3 times before she answered. Winnie. Lorna Whitmore's voice fluttered through the speaker. breathless and artificially sweet. What a surprise. Your father and I were just talking about how we need to fly out and see your new apartment. How is the East Coast treating you? Mother, put me on speakerphone, I said. My voice was entirely flat, stripped of any inflection. And make sure Beckett and Dad are in the room. I know it is Sunday dinner time. I know they are there. There was a brief pause, a rustle of fabric, and the faint, confused murmur of voices in the background. My mother's tone shifted, dropping the sugary facade to adopt the wounded, defensive posture she wore so well. All right, you are on speaker, she said, a heavy sigh whistling through the microphone. Honestly, Winter, what is with this tone every time you call lately? It feels like an interrogation. Why do you always have to turn everything into an attack on the family? This is not an attack, Lorna, I replied, using her first name to sever the maternal dynamic. This is a courtesy notification. You have exactly one window of opportunity to mitigate the damage you have caused. I strongly advise you to hire independent legal counsel by tomorrow morning. You need to self-report the structural anomalies in your business accounts, and you need to permanently detach my legal identity from every single corporate document under your control. A sharp, dismissive bark of laughter echoed from the other end of the line. It was Beckett. Whoa, dial it back. Counselor, my brother chimed in, his voice dripping with that familiar, effortless charm he used to lubricate his way out of parking tickets and bad breakups. What is with the dramatic vocabulary? Look, we had to move fast on the expansion financing. The underwriters needed a clean guarantor, and everybody knows you are the best at handling the paperwork in this house. We just borrowed your good credit score for a minute. It is keeping the family business afloat. You should be proud to be part of the team. He spoke as if committing a felony was simply a quirky family tradition. His casual arrogance was the final confirmation I needed. They truly believed I existed solely for their utility. I am not part of your team, I stated, the ice in my glass shifting with a soft clink. I am the victim of a coordinated identity theft. Do not patronize me. Beckett, I have the entire file. I know about the commercial loan modification for $750,000. I know the forged electronic signature was executed on the morning of May 24th, precisely when you knew I would be walking across a stage and unable to answer my phone. The line went dead silent. The ambient noise of their dining room, the clattering forks, the background television, seemed to instantly evaporate. The panic was suddenly palpable, transmitting clearly across 1,000 miles of fiber optic cable. I also know, I continued, driving the wedge deeper with absolute, surgical precision, about the 3 distinct urban revitalization grants you applied for in Kansas City. I know the payroll tax deductions do not match the full-time employee quotas you submitted under penalty of perjury. And I know the primary supply vendor you are wiring those overlapping government funds to is a fictitious shell company registered to Graham Whitmore. Now you listen to me, young lady. My father's voice boomed over the speaker, heavy, authoritative, and laced with sudden panic. He was trying to regain control by employing volume, a tactic that had worked when I was 12, but was entirely useless now. Every successful business is a little flexible with their books, my father growled, attempting to dress up systemic fraud as savvy entrepreneurship. It is how the real world operates. You would not understand that, sitting in some sterile office looking at spreadsheets all day. We are building a legacy here. You are just being vindictive. This is all because you are still throwing a tantrum over that silly graduation ceremony, isn't it? You are trying to sabotage your brother's livelihood out of pure, petty revenge. I took a slow, measured breath. The gaslighting was so textbook, so entirely predictable, that it almost bored me. If this were revenge, Dad, I said, my voice dropping an octave, settling into a tone that commanded absolute, terrifying authority. I would have called the regional business press. I would have sent the vendor wire logs directly to the Federal Inspector General anonymously. I am calling the family because there is still one door left to fix this quietly. If you hire a lawyer and untangle my name from the Embercrest Holding Company by Friday, I will handle my identity theft claim as a civil dispute with the bank. rather than a criminal complaint against my own flesh and blood. That is the only grace you are getting. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could picture them standing around the mahogany dining table, the color draining from their faces as the reality of their exposure finally pierced their impenetrable bubble of self-importance. Beckett, unable to handle the sudden evaporation of his golden boy narrative, snapped. "You are just jealous," he shouted, his voice cracking with genuine rage. The charming facade had completely melted away, leaving only a frightened, vicious child. "You have always been jealous of me. I am out here creating things. I am building an empire that people can actually touch and taste and experience in real life." What do you do? Winter. You sit alone in the dark, staring at a screen, tearing down people who actually take risks. You are nothing but a glorified calculator. His insult was supposed to wound me. Instead, it only highlighted the vast, unbridgeable chasm between us. He valued the illusion of success, the loud, visible applause, regardless of the rot underneath the floorboards. I valued the unshakable truth of the foundation. "A calculator," I replied softly, "does not lie. It simply reveals the deficit you created." I did not wait for my mother to start crying. I did not wait for my father to issue another hollow threat. I had delivered the parameters of their survival. The rest was up to them. "From this moment forward," I announced, clipping my words with finality, "you do not call this number. You do not email me. Any and all communication will go strictly through my retained legal counsel in Philadelphia. And understand this clearly. If any of you ever attempt to use my name, my credit, or my signature again, you will simply be pushing yourselves deeper into a hole you will never, ever climb out of." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. I sat back in my chair. The apartment was profoundly quiet. My hands were completely steady. I had expected to feel a surge of adrenaline, perhaps a lingering wave of guilt or sorrow for finally pulling the pin on my own family. But there was only a vast, empty clarity. I had spent 33 years trying to mold myself into a shape that would fit into their lives. By hanging up that phone, I had finally shattered the mold completely. I picked up the glass of water, took a long, refreshing drink, and turned my attention back to the future I was building entirely on my own. The mahogany conference table in my attorney's office was vast, polished, and entirely unforgiving. It was the perfect surface for dissecting a lie. My civil litigator had wasted no time. Following my explicit instructions, she had filed an aggressive injunction against the commercial bank, compelling them to produce the entire communication log associated with the Embercrest Hospitality Group loan modification. The bank, terrified of federal regulatory blowback regarding identity theft, had complied within a matter of days. I sat across from my lawyer, staring at a thick-bound dossier of printed digital correspondence, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sharp tang of printer toner. "Look at tab 4, my attorney instructed, her voice devoid of any sympathetic inflection, which I profoundly appreciated. I opened the heavy folder and flipped to the designated section. It was a printed email thread dated the 24th of May. The sender was the primary commercial underwriter at the regional bank. The recipients were Beckett's certified public accountant and a personal email address I recognized instantly. It belonged to my mother, Lorna. I read the timestamps. The first message was sent at 9:30 in the morning. The final reply was logged at 11:15 in the morning. The contents of the exchange completely dismantled the narrative I had been force-fed. The voicemail my mother had left me that morning, the breezy excuse about a spontaneous backyard barbecue to celebrate a signed contract, was a carefully constructed fabrication. According to the email thread, my mother was not standing over a grill with a plastic cup of beer. She was physically sitting in a downtown boardroom alongside Beckett and the bank's underwriting team, finalizing the massive capital restructuring package. The barbecue photograph they had uploaded to the family group chat must have been taken days prior, held in reserve as a digital alibi. My eyes moved to the final email in the chain, sent directly from my mother's tablet. Attached to this message was the high-resolution PDF file of the guarantor addendum, bearing the forged electronic signature we had already discovered. But it was the brief, two-sentence message typed in the body of the email that struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was a direct response to the bank underwriter asking if the guarantor, Winter Whitmore, could jump on a quick verification call to finalize the digital security protocol. My mother had typed, "She will be tied up at the ceremony until late. The digital signature protocol is fully authorized on her behalf." I read those words 3 times. She will be tied up at the ceremony until late. The cold, mechanical reality of their betrayal washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. My family had not simply chosen my brother's career over my academic milestone. They had actively, purposefully weaponized the most important day of my professional life. They needed a solid, verifiable window of time where I would be completely unreachable, separated from my cell phone, and distracted by university protocol. My doctoral graduation was not an event they regrettably missed. It was the precise logistical smokescreen they required to execute a massive financial crime using my name. "There is a secondary layer to this," my attorney said quietly, pulling another document from her sleek leather briefcase. "The bank's internal compliance rules dictate that whenever a new guarantor is added to a commercial credit line, a physical confirmation letter must be dispatched via certified mail to the guarantor's primary legal residence. We pulled the Postal Service records for your previous address in St. Louis." She slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany wood. It was an official United States Postal Service change of address confirmation. I looked at the form. Someone had submitted a highly specific, temporary mail forwarding order in my name. It was not a blanket forward for all my mail, which I would have noticed immediately. It was a filtered order, specifically redirecting correspondence originating from a localized list of financial institutions directly to my parents' suburban address. For months, they had not just forged my signature, they had proactively built a wall around my financial awareness. They intercepted the bank's confirmation letter, signed for it using my stolen identity, and destroyed the evidence before it could ever reach my apartment mailbox. Sitting in that sterile, air-conditioned office in Philadelphia, my mind violently rewound through the seemingly innocuous interactions of the past 6 months. Every casual conversation, every minor family request, was suddenly illuminated under a harsh, terrifying light. I remembered a phone call from my mother in early April. She had been exceptionally cheerful, asking me to send her a clear, scanned image of my passport. Her reasoning had been perfectly mundane. She claimed she was updating the family safe deposit box and wanted to ensure she had a copy of everyone's primary identification in case of an international emergency. I had scanned it and emailed it to her within the hour, unknowingly handing her the exact primary identification document the bank required to bypass the in-person identity verification. 2 weeks before the graduation ceremony, Beckett had texted me out of the blue. He had asked me to verify my exact apartment number and zip code. When I asked him why, he had replied, "Sending a graduation gift your way, sis. Do not want it getting lost in the mail." I had brushed off the fact that the gift never arrived, attributing it to his usual flakiness and lack of follow-through. It was not a forgotten gift. He needed my precise residential details to file the fraudulent postal forwarding order perfectly. And then, there was my father. The night before I put on my velvet academic robe, he had called me. His voice had been thick with what I thought was paternal pride. He had asked, "What exact hour are you walking across that stage, kiddo? I want to make sure we have our cameras ready for the live stream." He was not planning to watch me. He was confirming the exact parameters of their operational window. He needed to know precisely when the primary target would be offline. The puzzle pieces locked together with an audible, sickening click. The picture they formed was entirely devoid of love, neglect, or even basic familial dysfunction. It was a portrait of calculated, predatory extraction. The profound sorrow I had carried with me out of that staging area in St. Louis vanished, replaced by an absolute, crystalline understanding. The vacant seats in the auditorium audience were not a tragic accident of misaligned priorities. They were the empty spaces left behind by thieves who were busy raiding the vault while the guard was forced to look the other way. Every single interaction I had cherished over the last year, every rare moment where I felt like they were finally paying attention to my life, had been nothing more than a reconnaissance mission. They had mined my life for data points. They harvested my passport, my address, and my schedule, meticulously assembling the necessary tools to bind me to a massive debt without my knowledge. I closed the heavy dossier and pushed it back across the table toward my lawyer. The stinging pain of abandonment I had nursed for months was gone. In its place was something much colder, much sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. I was no longer the overlooked daughter waiting for an apology. I was the lead investigator on a fraud case, and the targets had just handed me the smoking gun. Once the official letter of representation from my attorney landed on my father's desk, the Whitmore family playbook abruptly changed. The aggressive bluster and the desperate attempts to gaslight me evaporated overnight. They realized they could no longer bully me into submission through a phone screen. So they deployed a highly orchestrated, deeply weaponized campaign of performative reconciliation. They attempted to drown me in a tidal wave of manufactured guilt, shifting the narrative from outright denial to a twisted plea for familial loyalty. It started with an email from my mother. It was nearly 3 pages long, filled with flowery language and desperate emotional appeals. She completely bypassed the reality of the felony identity theft, pivoting instead to a sprawling narrative about Beckett's supposedly fragile childhood. She wrote extensively about how he had always struggled with his confidence, how the commercial restaurant industry was ruthlessly unforgiving, and how he carried the crushing weight of the family legacy on his shoulders. The culminating paragraph was a masterpiece of manipulative maternal logic. "Being a mother," she wrote, "sometimes means you have to prioritize the more fragile child just to keep them breathing. I know you are strong. Winter, you have always been our rock. Please do not shatter your brother's entire life just because we leaned on you a little too hard when he was drowning." While my mother played the tragic peacemaker in private, Beckett went on the offensive in public. 48 hours after the legal notice was served, my phone began pinging with notifications and screenshots sent by concerned former high school classmates and distant cousins. Beckett had posted a lengthy, agonizing missive on his primary social media accounts. He did not use my name, but the target was unmistakable to anyone who knew our family dynamic. He posted a black and white photograph of himself looking exhausted but resolute, standing alone in his commercial kitchen. The caption detailed the heartbreaking reality of a relative betraying the family business. He wrote about the deep wounds inflicted by someone who would rather see a community staple close its doors than support their own blood. He painted himself as the hard-working visionary under attack by a bitter, vindictive outsider. The comment section quickly turned into a cesspool of misplaced sympathy, filled with hundreds of people praising his resilience and condemning the unnamed traitor. The social pressure reached a suffocating peak on a Thursday evening when my phone rang. It was my Aunt Carol, my father's older sister. I answered out of sheer morbid curiosity, wondering how far the misinformation campaign had spread. "Winter, darling," she began, her voice dripping with condescending sorrow. "We are all just sick over this entire situation. Your father is an absolute wreck. I know you were hurt that they missed your big day. We all know how much that degree meant to you. But please, sweetheart, do not kill your brother's future over a graduation ceremony. Family is forever. You cannot unring this bell. You need to drop this nonsense and come home so we can heal." I listened to her plead, realizing with absolute clarity that my family had successfully spun the narrative. They had convinced our entire extended circle that I was launching a nuclear assault simply because I was throwing a tantrum over a missed party. No one knew about the forged signatures, the stolen federal grants, or the hidden shell companies. They were entirely ignorant of the dark, criminal reality festering beneath the surface of the barbecue empire. The old version of me, the daughter who desperately craved their approval, would have drafted a furious defensive response. I would have taken to social media, posting receipts and screaming my truth into the digital void, desperately trying to convince everyone that I was the victim. I did not do that. Arguing with a coordinated smear campaign is like wrestling with smoke. It only leaves you gasping for air while your opponents watch you exhaust yourself. Instead, I responded with the crushing silent weight of the legal system. I instructed my attorney to formally file the civil suit for identity fraud in the district court, making the allegations a matter of public record. Simultaneously, I packaged every single piece of evidence I had gathered during my late-night investigations. I compiled the triple-dipped grant receipts, the forged commercial loan addendums, the postal forwarding orders, and the fake vendor wire transfers. I placed everything onto an encrypted drive and handed the entire portfolio over to an independent, third-party auditing firm retained by the city council. I removed myself from the emotional battlefield and let the raw, undeniable mathematics speak for me. While the wheels of justice began their slow, grinding turn, I continued to pull at the loose threads of Beckett's operation. The independent auditors needed more context regarding the fraudulent payroll submissions I had flagged earlier that month. I dove back into the human resources ledger, cross-referencing the 19 phantom employees Beckett had claimed on his urban revitalization grant application. What I found added another layer of calculated exploitation to his rap sheet. These were not entirely fabricated people made up of random social security numbers. They were actual, living individuals. I tracked down the tax identification numbers and matched them against local university enrollment databases. They were local college students. Beckett had hired them as casual, part-time seasonal help, paying them minimum wage to bus tables and wash dishes for perhaps 12 or 15 hours a week. However, without their knowledge or consent, he had taken their onboarding paperwork, inflated their hours on the internal corporate ledgers, and submitted their names to the federal government as full-time, salaried employees receiving comprehensive health care benefits. I made a specific, highly detailed note in my final report to the authorities regarding this discovery. It was crucial to emphasize that there were no children involved in this scheme, nor was there any physical abuse or physical exploitation of minors. The entire scope of the criminality was strictly white-collar. It was an elaborate web of adult identity abuse, subsidy fraud, and the systemic manipulation of financial records. Beckett was using the identities of young, struggling college students as human shields to absorb public money, stealing their financial footprints just as easily as he had stolen mine. The final, suffocating blow of the week did not come from a spreadsheet or a legal filing. It came in the form of an encrypted audio file, sent to my secure work email address by a man named Marcus. Marcus had been the internal bookkeeper for Embercrest Hospitality Group for 2 years, before abruptly resigning 6 months ago. He had seen the writing on the wall, and more importantly, he had heard the conversations happening behind closed doors. When news of the impending city audit began to leak through the restaurant industry whisper network, Marcus decided to preemptively clear his own conscience and secure his immunity by turning over his personal archives. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, stared out at the Philadelphia skyline, and pressed play. The recording was slightly muffled, likely captured on a cell phone left face down on a desk. I immediately recognized the ambient background noise of the restaurant office, the low hum of the commercial refrigeration units, and the faint, rhythmic clatter of silverware being sorted in the distance. Then, I heard my brother's voice. He was speaking to Marcus, his tone casual, arrogant, and entirely devoid of anxiety. They were apparently discussing the risky nature of the forged commercial loan documents they had just submitted to the bank. Marcus sounded incredibly nervous. "I am just saying, Beckett, if she ever pulls her own credit report, or if the bank flags the digital signature protocol, this is going to detonate. It is federal wire fraud." "Are you absolutely sure she's not going to notice the notifications?" Beckett laughed. It was a genuine, relaxed sound, the chuckle of a man who believed he was utterly invincible. "Relax, Mark," my brother said, his voice dripping with absolute certainty. "Even if she finds out, Winter will not sue the family. She is a rule follower. She wants Mom and Dad to love her too much to ever actually blow the whistle on this operation. Trust me, I know my sister. She is much better at enduring things than she is at rebelling." The audio file clicked off, leaving me in total silence. I sat perfectly still, letting the echo of his laughter bounce around the inside of my skull. He did not forge my name because he thought I was stupid. He forged my name because he believed my desperate need for their affection had rendered me completely powerless. He thought my lifelong habit of swallowing my own pain to keep the peace was a permanent condition. He viewed my loyalty not as a virtue, but as a fatal flaw to be exploited for capital gain. I did not cry. I did not feel a sudden rush of anger. The final tether of guilt holding me back simply dissolved into dust. I took off my headphones, closed the laptop, and felt a dangerous, razor-sharp smile form on my face. Beckett was about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when the person you rely on to endure your abuse finally decides to weaponize her endurance against you. The collapse of the Embercrest Hospitality Group did not happen in a single, explosive moment. It was a rapid, agonizing sequence of structural failures, much like watching a condemned building succumb to a controlled demolition. The evidence I had handed over to the independent municipal auditors acted as the initial detonator. Within 48 hours of receiving my encrypted drive, the City Council took decisive, catastrophic action. The preliminary audit results were so damning that the Municipal Oversight Committee immediately froze all undisbursed grant reimbursements. They issued a formal demand for a comprehensive, forensic reconciliation of every single ledger attached to my brother's corporate entity. The flow of public money, which Beckett had been relying on to cover his vastly inflated operating costs, evaporated instantly. The contagion spread rapidly to the private sector. The Regional Commercial Bank, already panicked by my civil litigator filing an injunction regarding the forged guarantor addendum, officially opened an internal fraud investigation. They did not just isolate the disputed modification, they placed a hard freeze on Beckett's entire portfolio. Every revolving line of credit, every corporate purchasing card, and every emergency overdraft account was immediately suspended pending a full legal review. My brother was suddenly operating a cash-heavy restaurant business with absolutely no access to capital. He could not order inventory. He could not make payroll for his legitimate staff. The timing could not have been more devastating. We were creeping toward the end of May, positioned right on the precipice of the summer dining season, which was traditionally the most lucrative quarter for the barbecue industry. The massive expansion project, the second location that was supposed to solidify his empire, ground to a violent halt. Construction crews walked off the site when their invoices bounced. Then, the ultimate fatal blow landed. Two of his primary private equity investors, sensing the impending legal bloodbath, exercised the emergency exit clauses in their term sheets and pulled their funding completely within the span of 1 week. The expansion was officially dead. As the financial oxygen was sucked out of his world, the incoming communications from my family escalated from an angry trickle to a desperate flood. My phone rang incessantly. The voicemails piled up, but the tone had drastically shifted. They were no longer screaming about loyalty or accusing me of petty jealousy. The arrogant bluster had been entirely replaced by a cloying, suffocating panic. For 2 weeks, I ignored every single attempt at contact, forwarding all digital correspondence directly to my attorney. But on a Tuesday evening, as I was leaving my office building in Philadelphia, I made a calculated decision to answer a call from my father's number. I needed to hear exactly how far they were willing to debase themselves to save their sinking ship. I stood on the bustling sidewalk, the noise of city traffic rushing past me, and pressed the phone to my ear. "Winter, please do not hang up," my father pleaded the second the line connected. His voice was remarkably small, stripped of all its usual booming authority. He sounded old and incredibly tired. "Your mother is right here. We just need 5 minutes." "You have 2 minutes," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "And I am recording this call for my legal counsel. Speak clearly." I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the frantic shuffling of a phone being passed. My mother came on the line. "Winnie, sweetheart, please," she begged, her voice trembling with genuine tears. "The bank is threatening to foreclose on the original restaurant property. They are talking about calling in the entire principal of the loan. Beckett is going to lose everything. He is going to be ruined." "Beckett ruined himself when he decided to commit federal wire fraud," I stated coldly. "What is the purpose of this call?" "Lorna." "We want to negotiate," she rushed out, the words tumbling over each other. "We spoke to our own lawyer. He said if you sign a sworn affidavit, a formal declaration stating that the electronic signature was just a miscommunication within family operations, the bank might back down. We can say you gave verbal consent, and there was just a paperwork error. If you sign it, we will sell off whatever we have to and pay you whatever you want. Just tell us your price. Please, do not send your brother to prison." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer audacity of her request wash over me. Even now, with the walls collapsing around them, their primary instinct was to ask me to compromise my own integrity to shield him. They wanted me to perjure myself, to legally absorb the blame for their criminality, just to keep his golden image intact. "I will not sign a fraudulent affidavit," I said, spacing my words out with absolute finality. "I will not lie to a federal institution to save a man who used my identity as a human shield. The answer is no. It will always be no." "Why are you doing this?" my mother shrieked, the facade of the desperate peacemaker finally cracking under the pressure of my refusal. The raw, ugly truth bled through her panic. "It was just a piece of paper. We needed the clearance that day. I thought you would understand that your brother's business was more urgent than a ceremonial formality." The sidewalk around me seemed to fade away. The roar of the Philadelphia traffic became a distant hum, a ceremonial formality. That was what my entire academic career, my years of grueling study, my late nights and my sacrifices amounted to in her eyes. It was a meaningless ritual, easily discarded the moment her son required a stepping stone. Her outburst was the final, agonizing validation of every quiet suspicion I had harbored for 33 years. She had not simply misjudged the importance of my graduation. In her mind, my achievements were entirely subordinate to his needs. My life was not just secondary, it was expendable. I was a resource to be harvested whenever Beckett ran out of his own. "Thank you for finally being honest," I whispered into the receiver. I ended the call before she could utter another word. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker until dawn. I felt a profound, hollow grief, but it was accompanied by an unbreakable resolve. The next morning, I arrived at my attorney's office for a scheduled review of the opposing counsel's discovery file. She was sitting at the polished mahogany table, a single manila folder resting in front of her. Her expression was darker than I had ever seen it. "I found something buried in the metadata of the emails we subpoenaed from Beckett's accountant," she said, her tone perfectly flat. She opened the folder and slid a printed document toward me. This was not a one-time crime of opportunity. Winter, they had a long-term strategy. I looked down at the paper. It was an early, unexecuted draft of a corporate operating agreement for the Embercrest Hospitality Group. It outlined the structural hierarchy for the planned franchise expansion. I scanned the paragraphs outlining the financial liabilities. There, buried in the dense legal terminology of Section 4, was my name. The document explicitly designated me as the primary perpetual guarantor for all future real estate leases and commercial credit lines associated with every new restaurant location they intended to open. My lungs seized. The air turned to ice in my throat. They had never intended to stop at a single, forged addendum. That first fraudulent signature on the day of my graduation was merely the test run. They had drafted a legal framework designed to secretly shackle my clean financial identity to his volatile business empire for the rest of my life. Every time he opened a new kitchen, every time he took on a new mountain of debt, my name would have been quietly pledged as the collateral. They were planning to build his entire future on top of a financial bomb wired directly to my life. I stared at the drafted agreement until the letters began to blur. The realization was terrifying. But it was also the ultimate cure for any lingering hesitation. If I had softened my stance, if I had caved to my mother's tears or my aunt's guilt trips, this story would not have ended with a single ruined graduation or one defaulted loan. It would have become a permanent life sentence. They would have bled me dry, year after year, until there was nothing left but the debts they accrued in my name. I looked up at my attorney. My hands were perfectly still. "Do not accept any settlement offers," I told her, my voice ringing with the cold, hard clarity of a gavel striking wood. "Do not agree to any private mediation. We are taking this to an open, public trial. I want every single document entered into the public record." The climax arrived not in a screaming match in a suburban living room, but in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned confines of a federal mediator's conference room in downtown Philadelphia. It was a combined civil hearing and pre-trial negotiation designed to address the identity fraud, the fabricated commercial guarantor addendum, and the falsified public grant applications. Beckett walked into that room wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, his jaw set in a line of stubborn, practiced arrogance. He still fundamentally believed that once the heavy oak doors clicked shut, the intimidating legal apparatus would magically melt away. He thought I would inevitably soften. He was banking heavily on the tired, manipulative cliché that blood is thicker than water. My mother sat beside him, her face completely drained of its usual vibrant color, dark circles bruising the delicate skin beneath her eyes. She wore the haggard, desperate expression of a woman trying to silently force me back into the role of the compliant, reasonable daughter one final time. My father sat rigidly on the end, his usual booming presence reduced to a nervous, twitching silence. I sat across the wide mahogany table from them, flanked by my civil litigator and a junior associate. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not deliver a dramatic, tearful monologue about my ruined graduation day. The time for emotional appeals and desperate pleas for validation had expired months ago. I was operating entirely as a forensic instrument, cold and precise. When the mediator, a stern former appellate judge, asked for our opening statement, I simply nodded to my attorney. Instead of a theatrical speech, she slid a thick, perfectly organized binder across the polished table, one by one. We entered the exhibits into the official record. We submitted the postal forwarding logs, proving they had systematically intercepted my financial mail. We submitted the forged loan addendum, highlighting the discrepancy in the electronic signature. We played the crisp, digital audio recording of my brother confidently assuring his terrified accountant that I was far too weak and eager for their affection to ever rebel against the family unit. With every new piece of evidence, my mother seemed to shrink physically into her oversized leather chair. Beckett's confident posture slowly unraveled, his hands gripping the edge of the heavy table until his knuckles turned completely white. Their high-priced defense attorney looked increasingly pale, realizing the absolute lack of a defensible position. But the absolute, undisputed death blow was the final document. My attorney pulled out the printed email thread between my mother and the commercial bank underwriter, dated the 24th of May. She did not just submit it into evidence. She read the critical line aloud, her clear voice echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. "She will be tied up at the ceremony until late. The digital signature protocol is fully authorized on her behalf." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The entire atmosphere of the room irreversibly shifted, the air growing heavy and dense. Up until that exact second, my family had been desperately clinging to the fabricated narrative that the forgery was a panicked mistake, a simple misunderstanding born of a chaotic, fast-paced business expansion. But hearing those specific words spoken aloud in a formal legal setting stripped away the very last shred of their plausible deniability. No one could pretend anymore. It was cold, calculated, predatory intent. They had weaponized my absence. Beckett finally snapped. The crushing pressure of his collapsing reality broke his meticulously maintained composure completely. He slammed his hands flat against the table and stood up, his heavy chair scraping violently against the carpet. "I was protecting the business," he yelled, his voice cracking with a volatile mixture of rage and terror. "I was trying to build something that would outlast all of us. I needed a clean name to secure the capital, and you were not even using yours. You just sit in a cubicle looking at screens. I was putting your name to actual, real-world use." He honestly thought he was defending his honor. He did not realize that with those few sentences, he had just confessed to the very core of his crime. He had publicly admitted that he viewed my identity, my pristine credit score, and my entire existence as nothing more than a valid, expendable tool for his own boundless ambition. The mediator immediately struck her gavel, ordering him to sit down and remain quiet. The opposing counsel frantically whispered into my father's ear, his hands gesturing wildly. They requested an immediate recess. When we reconvened 30 minutes later, their defense strategy had completely capitulated. They offered a private, closed-door settlement. They promised to rapidly liquidate assets to pay back the commercial loan, dissolve the fraudulent holding company, and offer me a substantial sum of money, provided I sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and formally withdraw all civil complaints. They wanted to bury the ugly truth in the dark, paying me off to maintain the illusion of their respectable family empire. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes, and then at my brother's defeated posture. "No," I said quietly, the single syllable carrying the undeniable weight of a falling anvil. I completely refused the closed-door mediation. I accepted a strictly public settlement. The terms were draconian and absolutely non-negotiable. I demanded full financial restitution for the legal damages and the emotional distress caused by the identity theft. I demanded the immediate, legally binding severing of my name from every single past, present, and future financial obligation attached to the Embercrest Hospitality Group. Finally, I secured a permanent, court-ordered civil injunction that explicitly prohibited any member of my immediate family from ever utilizing my identity, my physical signature, or my credit profile in any legal or corporate capacity for the rest of their natural lives. The fraud was etched into the public record forever, a permanent stain on their precious legacy. But the decision that left everyone in that room truly speechless was not the systematic destruction of his barbecue empire. It was what I chose to do with the ashes. When the first massive installment of the settlement compensation cleared my personal bank account 6 weeks later, I did not buy a luxury vehicle or a penthouse condominium. I transferred the entirety of the funds into a highly restricted, irrevocable educational trust. I established the Whitmore Quiet Achievement Fund. It was a targeted, specialized financial grant program formally partnered with my alma mater in St. Louis. It was designed specifically to provide robust financial support for first-generation doctoral candidates who were navigating the grueling, overwhelming isolation of advanced academia without a familial safety net. It was a dedicated fund for the quiet students whose families consistently viewed their monumental, life-altering academic successes as secondary events, as trivial milestones that could always be delayed or celebrated later. 3 months after the public settlement was finalized, I was officially invited back to St. Louis to formally inaugurate the scholarship at the university's prestigious autumn donor banquet. I wore a sharply tailored, slate-gray suit. The grand, opulent ballroom was filled with distinguished academics, wealthy philanthropists, and eager, brilliant graduate students. I stepped up to the polished wooden podium. The microphone hummed softly as I adjusted it. I looked out over the vast sea of faces. In the very front row, right exactly where the primary benefactors and their immediate families were meant to sit, there were 4 entirely empty chairs. I had requested them specifically from the event coordinators. Standing there, looking at those vacant seats, I did not feel the crushing, agonizing weight of abandonment that had nearly destroyed me a year ago in this very city. I stood tall, feeling the solid wood of the podium under my hands. I took a deep, steadying breath, and I read my name aloud to the massive crowd, slow and clear, Dr. Winter Whitmore. I looked at those empty chairs one last time. The space they left behind was no longer a bleeding, open wound. It was not a painful void waiting to be filled by people who fundamentally did not know how to value me. It was a clearing. It was clean, bright, and utterly silent. It was the undeniable, beautiful proof that I had finally audited my own life, recognized the massive emotional deficit, and chosen correctly. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Helena Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.